Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 195, Stars and Stripes and Stitches, Learning from Flag Designs. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome into the Takeup, and I am glad to have you here on this Friday. Sorry that we had a little bit of a jump. Couldn't see you guys right after July 4th, so we are back with a kind of a makeup episode since we're going to be talking about what you saw there in the thumbnail, stars, stripes, and stitches, learning from flag designs. Now we might look at some flags that aren't just the standard American flag here. So if you're here and you are not from the US, don't feel like this is all me just talking about American stuff. The truth of the matter is there's a lot that we can learn from the American flag design because it's something that's been redone over and over in so many ways, because it has to be used on so many things, and because maybe uniquely as a country we put our flag on just about everything. You'll find that we have created that flag and recreated that flag and changed that flag. In fact, so much so is this so pervasive that if I look right above that shoulder right here, you can see there's one of the flags I digitized on the wall just randomly in the old sample wall that I've got this picture of. The fact of the matter is we've made the U.S. flag in so many formats, at so many sizes, with so many permutations and waving and not waving and arched and in different artistic styles, that we have a lot of different variations in how it's been executed. Also, because of that, we can talk about some rules of embroidery, of art interpretation, and if not rules, the way that we handle things. I wouldn't say hard and fast that these are rules, but we can talk about the way that art gets interpreted and how we handle things differently in the lens of these different styles of patches and the different styles of designs featuring the U.S. flag. Now, certainly we're going to talk about other flags. We may get into some checkered flags, some other flags from other nationalities, depending. Truthfully, I'm going to try and keep this a fairly short episode. I'm short on time, and we have been having lots of technical difficulties today. So in all honesty, I'm going to keep things short and keep it to the point as best I can, though I will share with you certain designs that I've done before. I'm going to share with you all sorts of kind of techniques and tips related to this topic and related to the concept of resizing something, of interpreting it different sizes, of understanding where those differences come in. And I think what's going to be interesting about this is not so much that we're going to look at a bunch of flags, but that we're going to see that through the lens of this fairly simple design that has a couple of intricate things that have to be handled in a certain way. We're going to see things that are very universal to any embroidery design. Things like the interaction between different layers of stitches, things like the scale of certain designs, things like what we do with detail. All of these things are seen in these relatively similar and simple design executions, but they are different, and they do give us a little bit to talk about as far as how do we handle any art? How do we handle any logo? How do we handle anything on that scale? Now, as you guys know, if you are watching here on the replay, we would love to have you in the comments. But for those of you who are here live, you don't have to worry. I'm going to talk to you guys. I always say hi. If you're here on the replay squad, that is awesome. Please feel free to comment and ask questions. We will try and get to those if we can. And if nothing else, we would just like to hear that you're here. Otherwise, let's talk to some of the folks who are here live. First, Gail from Kingsbury Crafts here. Hello. Happy to see you here. Cindy's coming in and saying, good afternoon and happy Friday, everyone, from Gail, by the way. Doug's coming in saying hi from cloudy Los Angeles. Yeah, absolutely. We are hot here in New Mexico. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, it was a hot, sunny day. Jan, also in a toasty place. She says hello from Toasty, Texas. Hi, Jan. We also have from Minnesota Custom Made, Barb LaFon coming in. So good afternoon, everyone from North Central Minnesota. Glad to have you in as well. Everybody saying hi. Cindy saying hi to me. Hi, Cindy. We have lots of folks talking. Brent saying, hello, friends. Happy to see you here as well. Ron saying, good day, y'all, from Milk River. Cheers. Cheers to you, too. And Frank Dunn, awesome contributor. And thank you for sharing the show and always promoting education in all of your channels, no matter where it comes from. Thank you. From across the pond, Frank showing up for us. So in the UK. So for you, by the way, Frank, if you guys don't know, and I know you're going to seem like I'm outing you, Frank, he does my favorite post. He does my favorite post that I ever see on the 4th of July. And I'm just going to say this out loud. I know you guys are going to, some of you won't love it. I love it because the humor's there. A good-natured ribbing from our friends across the pond. Frank always puts up this meme that says, happy treason day. you ungrateful colonials. One of my favorite posts, bar none. It hits my humor just right. So thank you, Frank, for that. I'm glad that you will get to enjoy seeing our flag repeatedly throughout the hour. So there's my joke in return. But yeah, hey, Union Jacks work too. We can talk about those. I have before. All right, so we have a couple other folks tuning in. Susan Williams says, good afternoon. And we have everybody talking to each other, which I love to see. Yosta, good to see you in. Hi from Sweden. Happy to have you in as well. Maureen's coming in from Pennsylvania. Got Mary from Colorado Springs. Irene from Wisconsin. Boy, we are covering everything. Yeah, I know. Ron says, short program. Here's looking at a good hour and a half. I'm trying not to today. I really, to be quite honest with you, today has been a rough day. I could use less of the show today. My voice will go out before then. But the truth of the matter is we do have some good stuff to talk about. Honestly, the Stars and Stripes, whatever you think of our country, our current political process, or how we view patriotism in the country, we have a heck of an iconic flag that we like to use with, great regularity. So it does have something to say about how we decorate. And I think it's actually a good example because there is no digitizer who's been doing this for any period of time who doesn't have a ton of examples. Unfortunately, I had a crash earlier today that took out a big example file I had put together. Unfortunately, that means that I didn't find all of my examples back again. You guys have to remember I have over 16,000 designs that I've done over my career. So digging through them, if they aren't named flag, is difficult. I'm going to cover some of the more basic ones today. I might go back and find some of my big wavy crazy flags, but honestly, a lot of this will be universal whether or not you're warping the flag or not, because the flag itself just happens to have in the canton with all the stars, we've got this element of repeated pieces that are separate but have to be connected if we're trying to do this for production. We've got these overlapping satin stitches, generally, not always satins, depends on the size, obviously, but these overlapping satin stitches that are often running in the same angle that have to be handled. We often have a border that's going around all of this and maybe cutting into a fill. The canton itself, the blue corner, is generally also in a fill stitch of some kind. So we're dealing with what that does when it interacts with those satin stitches. And we have a lot we can talk about. Pull compensation, push compensation, sequencing of the design, pathing, how we travel through a design, the apparent motion of the needle. All of these things are revealed quite handily in the classic American flag design for sure. And we also, hey, Texas flag, I might even pull one up. I've done several because I'm in New Mexico. You better believe that I've digitized enough Arizona, Texas, and Colorado flags for my lifetime as well. Though, ton of them. Frank says, by the way, we left you them colors. All right, Frank. Thanks for the loan, my boy. Anyway, let's talk about it. We've got people talking. Yes, and he says Frank's a good sport. Absolutely, Frank's a good sport. I like to be a good sport too. Frankly, that really is, frankly, hilarious. Pun not intended. That is my favorite post on July 4th. Always. I'm sorry, I do love that one. That is my favorite post. I share it with people, and I catch the secondhand guff for it pretty frequently because I do love that post. All right, with that said, let's actually get into this. Let's talk about the Stars and Stripes and some things that are interesting about it, right? So we've got a couple different ways we can handle this. I'm going to throw some things up on the stage, and we're going to talk about the different options we have to discuss it and the different sorts of things that we can kind of, like I said, elucidate out of this situation of dealing with what the Stars and Stripes do when we do it with different sizes, how we handle that, levels of detail and all that. I think that's all pretty interesting, and it's all worthwhile to take a look at. Suffice it to say, we've got them in every variation, and yes, even the Texas flag I have here too, guys. But we do have all these variations of the Stars and Stripes, and frankly, no matter what variation we're dealing with, we kind of have this classic one that I would like to start from. The classic pre-made Stars and Stripes patch, the shoulder patch that we've all seen, the one that everyone knows, and in everybody in embroidery, if you haven't made one yourself, you have stitched on a pre-made one. We're going to actually start there because I think it's worthwhile to start there. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this up real quick. And what could be more American than showing it to you on Walmart.com? You can buy these anywhere, but yes, that up to and including Walmart itself. What I'm going to show you guys is this. This is the classic old school yellow border or gold bordered American flag patch that we all know and love, right? Now, this is from a third-party seller, but what I'm going to say is everybody who has made anything with a patch has used this patch. And the first thing I want you to know, let's take a look at this patch. This particular one, this is a classic marrowed edge patch. We can see that that's done on a standard marrow machine, fine with that. But what I'm going to say is lots of times we end up having to reproduce the look of this patch. So I've done many flag designs where they want the gold border on that flag. And yes, we can talk about flag code and all that stuff later. I think for our needs, we don't need to go that heavy into things like flag code. Plus, that's been clarified recently in ways that we didn't used to know back in the day. Suffice it to say, this is the classic flag. What are we going to notice about it immediately? It's primarily made of satin stitches. So the bars, stars and bars, our stripes are going to be made out of satin stitches, and they are all running in the same angle. What you're going to notice on a patch, however, if we look at this right this second, when you see that the white that's in there, that is about a 50% fill because this is going on a white fabric, and these are mass-produced patches that were done in an emblem shop. You can see just how gappy and loose that satin stitch is when you look at it on high zoom, whereas the really fully filled red stripes are there. When we're on a patch like this, it's on white twill, and we are absolutely losing a lot of that twill or a lot of that thread out of there, so we don't have to have that many stitches. Mass-produced patches are really big on doing that. If you don't need that color coverage, they won't do it. What I am also going to have you guys notice is the field of stars. Now, this one is not the tightest field of stars, but this is a really classic way to handle the stars on this size patch. Now, this size particularly, I believe this is probably, let's see, we actually show you what this one is. This one's a 3.5 by 2.5 inch. So this is kind of that classic sleeve sized patch that you might see. It's a little bigger. I've done some smaller and some larger, all with very similar work on them, though you can see they're actually showing us two different patches here. We look at this patch. The Canton, the blue field, does not have a satin stitch border. If we look at this patch that they're showing, this one does, because they've done a satin stitch border around it to clean up that edge. Those are two ways you can handle that border. And funny enough, this company has done them both ways. But the interesting thing to see is what we have is double straight stitch stars in the star field. And if you're careful, you can see it, though admittedly they've accidentally managed to tag in their leading stitch. The tail that came off got tagged into the corner, and they didn't see that when they're producing this image for this sales document. This is a continuous run. No trims are in this piece, and they're all connected. If we can see that each one of the diagonals is connected, and you see down here at the bottom, all the stars are connected in the bottom, and this is an excellent exercise in pathing. So stitching without lifting up the needle, without jumping, without tying off. And that is a really common way to handle those. So why am I showing you our friend the Walmart patch? Because honestly, it's one of the most classic styles of the US patch that you're going to see. You're going to see it pretty much everywhere. And frankly, one of the ones that I've remade multiple times, very similar piece. If you look at most of my pieces, they're going to be similar to that. The thing is, what's funny, I remember realizing just how kind of iconic this thing was when a good friend of mine, Jay Bissell, was printing. He was doing direct-to-garment printing, and he wanted to do faux embroidery direct-to-garment printing. And one of the things he did was scan the classic U.S. flag patch. So I'll go ahead and bring this up. This is a printed flag patch. And if I look at it, what's funny is I think our friend Jay might have done, or somebody around him, somebody ripped off that document, because check this out. When you look on that star that's up in the upper left-hand corner, the trim, the missing tail is on this piece too. So hey, whoever's in the printing department there, you might want to check who sourced that, because I don't think you scanned your own patch. I think you might have grabbed the one off the Walmart website or off of Google Images. Suffice it to say, they were making a sales sample. They weren't selling this, so I'm not going to give them too much grief about copyright or whatever. And honestly, on the flag and on this particular flag patch that we've all copied a million times, hard to fight it. But yeah, they used that very image to do their direct-to-garment printing, and which I'm going to show you in more detail in a moment. I'm going to go through some of these other flag patches. You'll see that some of my arm size patch sizes of the same kind of genre, these were done with satin stitch, but this preview is from the same type of thing. It was done in that same style with the connected run stitch stars. It is by far not the only way. We can see some different stars that are over here in this little star patch. We have a jacket back size down the bottom here that we're going to show in a minute that has fully filled stars that are not done in the same way. Over here on this lineman patch, we have some that are drawn out in star shapes, and I'll show you a double trace star, I'm going to call it now. I'm just going to make that up right here and now. It's very similar to what's here on this Cuba patch. This little kiwi patch you see on the left-hand side, here's the center bottom portion of it from that badge, and it has that double run star or a single run star in that same style. There are a million ways to make stars and fields, and we're going to talk about them as we go. But there are some interesting rules we can start to come up with when we start looking at how each one of these sizes was put together, right? Suffice it to say, the stars and stripe, they are going to be very similar throughout. We're doing something pretty similar as we go. However, there are some things we can elucidate almost immediately. And the first one is this. As size decreases, so must detail. The smaller we go in any given design, we will find that there is eventually a physical limit that we have as far as how many stitches physically at a certain thread size can fit into an area. So frankly, when we're looking at these different flags, and I can pull some of these back up again, when we're looking at these different flags as we go through, when we're starting down here at this jacket back size, we can see these full stars. I'm going to talk about those again. When we go up to these pocket sizes, we have certainly we have larger and smaller sizes like that have all 50 stars still there, but you can see as they get larger and smaller, they get denser. They're denser when they're close together because that straight stitch does not get any smaller. 2 passes of straight stitch and 40 weight thread is going to be the same thickness no matter how large the area is. So if we only use 2 passes, it will only ever be that same size. And this one that I know looks really hinky. You see this guy in the center? It's a very, very small waving flag design that goes on the side of a hat right at the temple. And this very small design, the very first thing you're going to say about this is, hey, man, that is not 50 states that you're representing there. And you're absolutely correct. We don't do 50 stars when we're down at the smallest sizes. When we're at a jacket back size, we've got fully connected satin stitch overlap stars. They fit. There's no problem with that because we have the area to put those in. We can fit this in and there's space between. Because remember, if we don't have enough space between stitched elements, what do we have? We have coverage. We end up with full coverage, and that means that we no longer have an area we can see that color through. So this has full satin stitches. That's fine. When we start to get smaller, we might have we have these sort of trace stars, and we'll show you those in other formats as well, like we have them here on the lineman design. I'm going to show you this actual design in a second, where these are actually traced, and they're actually traced double. There's an internal star and an external star that makes them fully fill at this size. And we actually draw the star out the way you would draw it when you were a kid with a pencil. You draw it from point to point. Yes, we do some different things to keep them connected and to try not to jump around the design, but it's very similar. Then we also have this size. If we're in between those two, because smaller or larger, this is a smaller rendition, you see, because the thickness doesn't change. We have those individual stars that are drawn out from the center, and these are double run stars. So as we go further down, and then we get down to this size, the cap side size, and I'll show you more of the relative size in a moment, then we reduce the number of those stars and we can make them smaller. We just want to make sure we have some space in between them to see what's going on. So we have some clear area. This is another tiny field patch like that over here with this subdued olive patch. But then when we get to the very smallest sizes, and we're going to talk about this in more detail later, now we start to reverse the whole process. And we're not drawing stars at all. I'm drawing the blue canton over a white fill, and I'm using essentially kind of a hash mark, 2 fills in 2 directions, and a nice border to keep that line. And I'm intimating what should be there, not replicating it. I'm giving a hint of what should be there, because at the size of the actual badge, when the actual badge is done, and I'll go ahead and take that banner down so we can see the whole badge and not have it in front of everything. At the size the badge is when it's finished, when you are back away from this badge that's a left chest on a shirt, you have these small white dots going through this blue mesh, and those small white dots look like there are stars. Your brain will tell you there are stars. Also, the amount of these red stripes that are in there, absolutely not the correct amount. But it's not that critical when we're down to the point where we're at the size of the end of a pencil or a pencil eraser. It's not critical down under a centimeter for those things. We no longer have to worry about that. So as size decreases, so much detail, right? And of course, what's the other part of that is intimate, don't replicate. You don't need to replicate everything in the art, You just need to show what should be there when we get down to the smallest sizes. But yeah, as size decreases, so must detail. Detail must decrease. Why? It's just physical. It's space. As we have too many stitches too close together, if each of these fingers are a stitch and they are right close together, eventually there will be nothing behind them. The detail cannot be seen if it's completely slammed together. Not to mention, as we know, every time we stick a needle and thread through our garment, we leave these wedges of thread behind that spread apart the garment, and they come into contact with each other and they move the garment away from itself and spread the threads apart. And that causes three-dimensional distortion where it pops up or it bows down or it warps because we've added so much thread and we've spread apart the threads of the existing garment that exists. There is a physical limit to how many times we can put a needle in an area, and there is a physical limit in 2 dimensions to how close together things can be before they cover up what's behind them. And that physical limit, especially when we start to think about how much of that background we want to see, is what's setting how much detail can be placed there. Also, when we're talking about the length of a stitch itself, we have to have, between 2 stitch points, we have to have some fabric there. We get to a point where if your 2 needle points are right next to each other and you try and make a stitch and there is no room for any thread of the garment between those 2 points, the stitch will sink in, will make a large hole, and may start to do things like cause bird nesting on your machine, in your design. So we know we have to have a certain minimum length, and part of that is to deal with our needle width, the size of our needle, and of course the thread thickness. We know we need a certain density to get some sort of background color to show through, and we know ultimately that we can't just jam as many needle drops as we might want to in any given area without distorting the garment, without pulling holes in it, without causing bird nests and bumps and lumps and all the things that cause embroidery to have a poor hand and to feel bad on the person as it's worn, for a garment. All of these things are there. So what it means is, we know one of the rules is, as we decrease in size, no matter what we're trying to represent, we must decrease the amount of detail, the number of lines, the number of stitches in that given area. And that means we have to make compromises. And that's where we get into the concept of, intimate, don't replicate. Let's pull up a design. Let's go ahead and show some of these and actually look at them in their natural habitat in embroidery software. Let's take a look at these. This is one of the classic sleeves here. So here we are. As we can see, we've got pretty heavy coverage on this. I'm not going to lie, because this piece is going on something really dark and had a little bit of fuzz to it. One thing you will notice is a lot of folks will they'll run vertical. I tend to run horizontal. Why do I run horizontal on my fills for this Canton in blue? Well, because one of the other things we're going to talk about today is stitches meeting in the same angle fall together. So if we have vertical fills here and we have this nice vertical stitch that's at the top of these stars, that one stitch is going to try and sink down a little bit and pull. If this was going on something really, iron hard, like some of the polyester twills, probably won't see a ton of that, but you'll still see it sink more. You'll still try and sink down. And I'll go ahead and pull myself back up here a little larger. As we know, whenever stitches meet, if we have all stitches going this angle and we start to put stitches on them the same angle, just like my fingers here, they're going to want to try and drop into each other. They want to try and blend. They're going to fall together. And so why do I change that angle? Because I'm trying to make sure that that central vertical ray of the star does not sink in and I don't lose it, because that can happen quite easily. You can end up with that ray of the star just dropping in. And in fact, one of the times this happens to me a lot is actually with the New Mexico flag. If I have tiny New Mexico flags, the tiny New Mexico flags are the worst for that. And I don't know if I've got a little tiny one here or not. I thought I had one loaded up. This is a larger one. So this is a standard New Mexico flag that has the Zia symbol in satin stitches. A lot of these are really old school files of mine, so I'm sure they won't all be perfect. The tiny one, though, the problem we have with the tiny one, and this one actually has a jump stitch that shouldn't be showing, but you'll see that tiny one, I never use 45-degree angles on fills. I mean, this is a very small piece. You see these are actually centimeter marks here behind that, so we're talking about like maybe a little less than an inch wide, not quite an inch wide on this piece. When we look at a piece that's like this, I will sometimes do it when I'm putting these straight stitch Zias on top. Why the straight stitch Zias? If I made this vertical or horizontal or too close to the vertical or horizontal, you would see these stitches would all fall in on one of the sides of the Zia. So this is one of the rare times where you might catch me using something close to a 45-degree angle. I usually don't do it, and honestly, I could probably lessen the angle a little bit on this one, but I'm going to be honest with you and say I was playing with this for teeny tiny New Mexico flags on dad hats, and I had it fall in a couple times on my normal 13-degree angle. It didn't quite make it, and I just got grumpy and said go for the 45, and because I had a satin stitch border, it really didn't show too much pulling. It wasn't too bad for that little tiny bit of stitching. However, like I said, stitches in the same angle, they distort more and they fall together. So if we're going to have them fall together, we need to work on that. We need to do something about it. So let's go back, if we can, to the original flag we were talking about. Let's talk about that larger, that larger U.S. flag sleeve. And you'll see that we have a horizontal angle to our fill. Probably could have gone a little bit of an angle on that, but we have that horizontal angle so that none of these stitches, they all come out at angles from this center ray. And as that happens, none of these are going to fall in. So that is something that we're doing very purposefully. What are the other purposeful things that we've done on this design that are interesting to see? Well, a couple of other purposeful things. We've got a fair amount of overlap on these. Probably need a little bit more pull comp if we were dealing with a smaller flag. As we get smaller, you need slightly more comp. As we get smaller, you'll see more overlap, but we do have a good solid overlap between these lines. And you'll see that if this is the point on the underside of it, that's the white. You can see how the white is overlapping quite a bit. If we go ahead and measure that piece here, we've got about a millimeter, a little bit over a millimeter of overlap on that, 1.2 to 1.3 millimeters. It's a pretty good overlap. And what you can also see is we're definitely well into each of those satin stitches so that these lock in. We also have these lovely kind of German underlays. It's an edge run plus a double zig. Pretty good underlay, pretty standard for me trying to deal with something if I'm trying to really make that heavy, full, complete coverage. The real complete coverage, I'm going to do something like that pretty frequently on a wide satin stitch. So what we've seen here, we've got overlaps. We're dealing with stitches. One of the things we also have to realize, even on those little stars like we talked about, all stitches pull. So you're going to see that these really do reach out very close to that border. Also, all filled areas push. So you can see that we have some pull comp area on the right-hand side of that canton, but we're pretty close to the stars on the bottom because it's going to push out a little bit. It's going to pull in on that side just a little bit. We want to give it some breathing room, but we can also see that we're pretty close to those lines. Those stars are going to get a little bit smaller as they run. The rays will tighten up just a little bit. So when we're doing that, we are trying to kind of compensate for all that stuff, but certainly that deep inset between satin stitches that are in the same angle next to each other, that is a very specific thing that we do. We are trying to get nice deep overlaps because when we do that, we end up with a much better overall coverage. We're not going to have splitting, which a lot of people do. They end up in this point where they get this splitting that they can't avoid, and that really is because they're not deeply overlapping these pieces. So most of this is not that interesting to watch on a run through. Satins, we do have travel stitches. You can see that we're using travel stitches. The other thing you might see is I actually have a little bit of I've got a border on this just to hold the area flat in this particular piece. We had I believe these were on quilted jackets where I had to have 2 layers held together. I've got so many versions of this, I just grabbed one, so I can't tell you for sure which one's which. On these, I might have also gone back and forth if I were trying to do this most times, but in this case, I went one direction on all of them. If you're compensating correctly, shouldn't be a big deal. So this is not that interesting. Most of this is pretty standard. We do have a tatami-style fill underlay on this piece. And then the more interesting thing to watch, and it'll be a little harder for us to see, is the star formation, right? And we won't be able to see every single stitch, but I'll try and pop through these. And we'll try and pop through these kind of individually as much as we can. But you'll see that as these form, we're thinking ahead into the travel, right? We're thinking about the eventual travel, and we're only going over each line twice to the best of our abilities to get through here. So this also, and you also might see that this is not a perfect strand through it. You might have a little bit of thickness on a couple to justify the movement, but we are connecting. And in this case, we connected horizontally. If you look at the ones that were done on the other patch, those were done diagonally. You'll often see them done in diagonal rows, but then what'll happen is you go in diagonal rows, you'll pop over the bottom or up to the top. You'll travel out to it and then come back. If you want to hide travel stitching, you can't avoid going over a line more than once, smaller travel stitches, you can go ahead and run a smaller stitch length, and that will sink them further down so that your longer stitches that you're doing on the stars eventually will run more appropriately. But yeah, other little US flags. Here is a small version of it. So if we're looking at this at 1-to-1 sizing, this is a much smaller size done with the same star patterns. Things you should notice about going to that smaller size is that the overlaps are deeper because we're going to get kind of the same amount of pull, and that same amount of pull will make that the red stripes will equalize with the white. You're also going to see a little extra room for push between the two of these. This is going to push out, this is going to pull in, but this is largely the very same design done at the smallest size that these stitches can connect. So we'll go ahead and just run through it again. Very, very similar process. You'll notice that there's less underlay on these. They only have an edge run aside from the travel. And then these are done in a very similar fashion. So once again, thinking ahead of the connections and running ahead where we have to in order to make the travel work. As you can see, I jumped down into this corner. When we get to that third stripe or the fourth stripe, I jumped down into the fifth stripe. Why? So that when we get to this point over here, I've got a more reasonable travel path. But all one connected line, no jumps, no trims, nothing else. This is all about just thinking ahead and playing with that concept of not picking up the pencil. If it's something you haven't done before, it's worth trying it on a field of stars because it's a really good exercise for that. These fields of connected stars like that really do work. But the thing is, we can see when we have more space in it, we can do different stuff. I mean, here's a jacket back size. So if we were talking about these flags, we're going to go ahead and put these out. Here was that size. Here's this piece. If we had one that was larger that was being done on a center jacket, it's not a full-size jacket. It's not huge, but it's a pretty good-sized jacket back patch, right? So we're talking somewhere in the realm of 10 inches wide. It's pretty big. When we do a piece like this, we might have quite a lot more room. Certainly, you're going to notice that we are using fill stitches for our stripes. If this is a fully filled piece, it's not an applique. It was intended to be fully embroidered. We're not going to use applique. We're not going to use satin stitches at this size because we're well up to limits that would be much too large. We're past our 10, 12 millimeter limit where we're going to be real comfortable with a standard satin stitch. You might play with it. You might try it. But truthfully, this and any larger, you're probably going to go fill stitches. But one of the things we're going to notice, remember we talked about fill angles falling into each other? We have opposing angles. So in this case, we're probably 12 degrees here, and then we have the opposite angle on the white. Why? When these come together, if we use opposing angles, those things will not fall together anymore. So why do we do that? If we were to run them all horizontally, wherever the two bars of fill interacted when they overlapped so that we don't have a gap, we would have a couple of lines that were trying to sync together, and you would probably see a kind of blending that would happen where you'd see a little bit of the white in the red. Instead of doing that, we have opposing angles. Why? So that when those edges hit, whatever's on top is going to stay on top. It's just like underlay. It's running at a different angle from the bottom, and so whatever's on top is going to stay on top, and they won't blend in. So it really depends. Brent says, and I got a good question from Brent, would you ever do the white stripes as a whole fill with the red stripes as satin over the white fill? Sometimes. I rarely do when we're talking about that classic style because then the texture is different between the two sets of stripes. I actually do have an example of that, though. If you want to see an example of that, yes, you can. When we're doing fairly large patches, it's much less stitch count to use those satins. And if I was on a patch like I showed you earlier, I'd probably decrease the white or eliminate the white even if the people didn't mind the texture, but decreasing it means I can keep that satin kind of shine. But when we're talking about fully filled patches at that size, I'm usually going to run the stripes both as satin stitches because I want them to look uniform between the two stripe types, right? The two stripe colors. However, I do have an example that's run like that. Let me see if I can pull that up while we're here. I do have an example of a piece done where it wasn't critical. It was part of other stuff that was happening in that design, and it's not the red stripes, it's not a US flag, but it is a similar case, and this is for a checkered flag. And I do it pretty often with checkered flags because the checkered flags, it feels more like a field with checkers on it. It's not as critical to me for texture the way the US flag is. But let me show it to you on a checkered flag. And this is for a motorsports team from the Lobos, the UNM Lobos, the University of Mexico Lobos, that I did some work for. Ignore the logo. The trims are all goofy on it, but let's just jump into the flag itself. I'm not going to try and reset all the trims that showed incorrectly in the logo face. We actually talked about it. You want to go back to the mascot episode, you can hear more about it. But this is a checkered flag done in that similar style. And you can see I do indeed have a white fill under it. I'm dealing with a flag that's got these little warpy pieces in it. It's supposed to look like it's folding back on itself. It's in a pretty graphical style. In that case, I did indeed decide to go ahead and do white underneath. We'll zip through it. I do have a fill underneath it with a slightly offset angle. And then when we get into, we'll eventually get to these checkers. Let me show you the checkers. I was moving from the inside toward the outside. I went ahead and kind of cheated that and butted those checkers up against the flagpole. In this case, I don't think it looked too bad, especially in black. But the interesting thing you can see about the pathing, and let's go ahead and kind of watch that a little more carefully. As we're looking at the pathing on this piece, we can see that I am very careful to use travel stitches. I jump from the corners, and we can kind of see it as we start moving through here. I will jump using the corners as connectors from one square to the other so that I don't have to trim in between these or try and travel. You're going to see me using these travel stitches to keep this all in one connected piece for production's sake. That's probably the only real interesting thing about that as far as checkers go. You'll see in a lot of checkered flags that if you look carefully, where they meet close to the corners is going to be that way. Also, you'll notice that the checks look a little out of square. Part of that's because the flag is supposed to be waving. The other part of that is because I'm also accounting for pull and push compensation. As those satin stitches pull in, they're going to get shorter, and because of they are essentially in the vertical of the flag is where the stitch angle is, and they're going to then expand out on the kind of the width of the flag. They'll expand to these directions, left and right here, and they're going to contract up and down. As they do these, they're going to become much more square like the original art. But yeah, there are times in which you might run that white behind it. And if you didn't care that much about what's going on with texture, or when you're running really small. So let's go ahead and we'll stop this and jump back. I'll go ahead and bring the design back up once I've found my spot. But we'll go ahead and go to the Cuba flag so I can grab those, and we can kind of explain a little bit more of why I might do that. Let me see if I can pull up that Cuba badge that I showed you guys earlier. We're going to pull up the actual design here real quickly and take a look at that. So this is the design at size compared to the other things you've already seen. You can see how much smaller that American flag is compared to the ones we've been dealing with. I mean, if we go look at some of those other flags, it's much, much larger. But we'll zoom in on the Cuba flag here. And I've got another straight trim. For some reason, this thing is showing some straight trims. The designs that I brought in for this are not coding those trims correctly, the actual stitch file. So I'm going to go ahead and pop that out so you can't see it quite as hard here. So let's take that off, take the stitch points off, and you're going to see for this one also, yeah, it's absolutely a white fill behind it. There it is. So there's our white fill that's behind that piece. And as we run up to it, eventually we do run that grid over the top. So let's go ahead and bring that up to that point. We'll go through all the satins, all this other happy stuff. First thing you're going to see is we do have a kind of vertical. Why am I using a vertical here instead of a horizontal? Well, think about it. I'm going to have horizontal straight stitch stripes, and I'm going to have a grid that runs 45 and 135 degrees, a screen, like a chain link fence sort of grid for my stars. So I'm definitely going to want to have something that doesn't match any of those lines. So once we start going in, you're going to see, and I'll back this up a little bit so we can see it. We have doubled runs for the red. So as we run through, we've got double runs for the red that I'm traveling up the fold. You can see the perceived fold in the flag. I'm using it as a travel line so that it's not as bold as it would be. So right through those travel lines, and then I'm locking off there. And then we'll see we get to the canton here, and that is just a grid made manually. So I went in with the diagonals and started making this grid manually. So it's not just fills, it's actually doubled lines. And then manually at the very end, I run the border sections of the canton so that we get that grid showing through. And that most definitely has a white fill underneath. As we get very, very small, we might elect not to break that up. But for most classic flags, if we're dealing with the very classic star flag that we were showing earlier, at this size and for that texture, we really want to maintain texture between the stripes. So we use the same kind of stitches. And I mean, a lot of other ones will be different. If you do something stylistic with the flag, this piece was done eventually on a patch, and I'll show you the eventual patch. And this is one you guys can download if you want to. This is the Lady Liberty patch I did. It's a classic patch I did, and I redid it again as a freebie for Embrilliance. So this is actually native. This is all in Embrilliance natively here. You can see all the objects. But this one, I omitted all of the white because this is going on a white felt patch. The other thing you're going to notice is that I've used a split satin or a length limit satin stitch in here for these. So I've got a satin texture, but it's got a little bit of breaks in it and it lays a little flatter. And then you're going to notice because they're large enough, I actually have these stars that are 5 satin stitches clustered together to make the stars. What's interesting about this one is to look at, you see how fat and nubby these little stars look, but they only have a very minimal amount of underlay if we look closely at them. A little hard to see that on an underlay that's there, but we can kind of see like that this is a fairly minimal amount of underlay. If I pull this over to a bare area in the design, we can go ahead and see that we've got edge run only, and it's very deeply inset. So what does that mean when this actually runs? Well, let's pop over to our gallery here, and we should be able to take a look at it. In fact, I'll go to the freebie page. Look at how those stars run. So there is the actual run from that design. Look at how pointy and how narrow those star points are. And then go back and look at this and look at how fat and lumpy those look. That is what we call pull compensation. Pull will do that. Also, like I said, we omitted the white fill in here. Why? We're going on white felt, and I didn't really feel the need to add that in. Now, if I look back on this piece again and I think about the negative spaces that are there, I could have done some white stitching here to kind of really accentuate the differences. Though I've got some odd spaces that might have made that look a little strange if I was leaving the open area inside of Lady Liberty here as I was. The thing to remember about this piece, the original art came from, honestly, a mass-produced piece of fabric that was done for the bicentennial. I could not find a source for it, and I made this piece based on it somewhat. So this print was kind of a mass-produced print on a throwaway piece that was done, for the bicentennial, so 76, and was really meant to be quickly printed. So it only had the 3 colors on it. It had black, it had red, it had blue, and everything else was the white of the original fabric that was behind it, the original material that was behind it. So these kind of prints are just something that, the origin of the print does also kind of show you how the rest of it was printed, how we don't have any more background material behind the head here, and how we have just open spaces. I kind of went with it. Plus, admittedly, I do like the felt texture. But yeah, this is the original piece. If I go back to our design, you can see that the stars look much fatter. The details look, the openness it looks like you might have in the crown is not open at all. Those are manually done. It looks very jagged here, but if we look at the actual piece, a little bit of jaggedness, not that much. It looks sketchy the way it's originally meant, but the lines look much finer. In thread, on fabric, really this makes the difference. You can tell that things just run differently than what you might expect. But yeah, that's kind of how those are put together. We can omit certain things. We can choose to do certain things differently. And by all means, we can tell that what's on screen is always kind of lying to us. I've said this a million times. Pull and push compensation are absolutely in effect at all times. And we can also tell that it is partially underlay that evaluates and creates the shape for that final star, the underlay being where it is and holding up the star itself and allowing for points. So like I said, it really depends. It is funny how those little fat stars that look so lumpy and so awful look so clean and so sharp on the final piece. It's because of that underlay being present, and it's because of pull, accounting for that pull and knowing what's going to happen with that pull. And if we look at the angles in the piece, the other reason I can tell you I know we were going to see some of that pull, even though I wanted to offset the angles somewhat, I had to kind of deal with the stitch angles and have them interact with that open space around the crown. Here's the other thing to look at while we're talking about this design. If we look inside that crown, you see how that blue stops early? Why does that blue stop early before these lines? Well, because I didn't want it to push down inside of the crown, and you see it doesn't. It stops really closely to that single straight stitch outline that's there. It's very close. And you might see a little bit of gapping happening there, but not much. And that's dealing with a razor thin straight stitch outline. It's got maybe 3 lines of straight stitch that are there. We are not covering that gap. We don't have a way to cover up that space. It's not a big satin where it's going to cover that up. So in dealing with the natural angle of that fill, I realized that some of these stars are going to pull, especially up here in the verticals, they're going to pull on an angle that's very similar. They're going to stitch at this angle that's very similar to the fill. That means they're going to pull even more. And you'll notice that my stars are a little fat on that vertical. We really are trying to deal with that natural pull. And because, as we showed before, and I'm going to bring it back out here to the outside one more time so you can see it, that underlay that's present is really narrow. Though this is going to be thicker, obviously, these lines are not as thick as thread is. As that underlay runs, we're going to see this pullback. We're seeing the object line. So ignore that first line. That's the object line. The actual stitches that are there, it's going to pull back quite a bit before it hits into that edge run underlay. It's going to maintain the edge. So kind of cool stuff there. Like I said, it is something interesting to look at those stars. And I think stars is the other thing we're going to talk about really quickly as we kind of move on through this. Different shapes of stars really do get done in different ways. But we'll go back to, let's go ahead and go to that jack-and-back size flag that we were talking about just a moment ago. And we'll go back to the entire thing. There's all of it. There it is at size with our centimeter scale marks there in our grid. Things you're going to notice, traveling stitches are at the corners. These things are connected. We are not trimming between them even on the big flag. There could be an argument for trimming between them if you wanted to. For this production, for mass production, we're trying not to trim, so we've got it pretty close. Also, though it looks like these are big gaps far away, remember, we're going to push. The ends of each of these guys is going to push up or out. It's going to push in the direction contrary to the angle. And as we push into that direction, very obviously it's going to get longer and those points are going to extend. Pardon me, taking a drink. But the other thing you're going to notice, because these are so large and I wanted to make sure I had very fine points, I'm going to zoom in even further. One of the tricks to getting these really super fine points, and we'll zoom in and we'll try and take a look at this if we can. It's a little hard to see in the white, and I should have thought about that. You'll see that I have made these little points that stick out. These are straight stitch points that are done before we finish the star. Why is it done like that? Because as this pushes up, there'll be one little stitch point just outside of the column, and it makes that star look super, super sharp at larger sizes. We can make them look really sharp by having this push out, because it's going to push out about 2 stitch widths. So it's going to push out like a full density. Say that we push out to about here. Well, what we're going to have is this pulls right in. We're going to have this one little stitch that just peeks out of the edge of that satin. And when it does that, it's going to make these stars look really sharp pointed. So let's go and get the whole thing on screen for a second, and I will kind of run through it very quickly. Running through the fill on the bars is not that interesting, other than just seeing we do have a nice opposed kind of tatami style fill here. So we are getting that tatami fill coverage in there. And then we have the opposed angles. Interesting enough as it is, but not that critical. You can see we did use traveling runs. Then we have our canton running after that. And then we can start to see the planning that goes into the stars. And it's not perfect. The very last one on this piece, there's jumping around. But we are working in order to travel in a way that we don't have to jump around. So what I'll actually do is, as we get kind of to one of these rows ending, let's go ahead and see if I can show it a little bit slower here. We'll try and go through. The problem is we also have these fully filled satins, so it takes a long time. If I go stitch by stitch, it'll take forever. It might not be something I can do very easily. Let me try and speed the run up a little bit. Sometimes when I'm doing this on the live, it's not very successful in refreshing that video quickly when I share screens. But you can start to see how it's filling in, running toward centers, but then the last of the satins goes from the center out, so I can connect to the next one that's there. And you'll see that I've traveled to a place where I can get back and come back from and leave it connected. Like I said, the last row on this one, because of the way I traveled on it, I ended up where on a smaller flag, I might have traveled under the border. If the border was really close, I might have jumped over the border to travel, and ended up where I couldn't travel the way that I originally had intended to. And I thought, forget it, I'm going to trim these. It wasn't a big deal. So the last one's actually jump and trim, and I really could have probably figured out a way to do the last row and then alternated between the final row and back and forth into that second star. So that is a mistake on my part. When I saw that, I was like, man, I must not have done that many of these because I just elected to trim those myself. At the same time, you'll see at the very end, we do have this really big gold border. It's done in the same style as the classic patch. And this one actually does have a pretty substantial underlay on it, because I wanted that border to stand up and be very patch-like. So I've got that classic German underlay border that I often do with wide satins so that I can get that nice, big, high crown. Once again, the things that are interesting to think about that is that we have pathing and we can plan ahead. I didn't do it perfectly. I look at it now and think, well, if I had gotten to this point, I probably could have run this star, then back in, and then back out and back in. I just would have had to leave these stars out. In this case, I could have done a better job on the pathing. I'm showing you. Sometimes that's the thing you have to do is if you want somebody to learn from a piece, you have to be honest about the way you've done it. This could be pathed better. Certainly some of my other stars are done better. And on this case, this has too many trims for what it has to, because I've not trimmed anywhere else. I probably could have handled that last row better. But you'll see throughout the rest of it's entirely connected. That's often the case with a lot of the mass-produced patches. Especially mass-produced flag designs, they're going to be connected one way or another. And also why you see so many of them have those classic little stars, the classic little run-out stars. However, while we're here, because we're talking about stars, I wanted to show you some of those other options, right? So we've talked about little tiny stars, right? First, we have this star, the classic star I just showed you. This is the one. This is very similar to the one you just saw from the Lady Liberty design. The only thing different about this one is I have those points, those drawn out points that are outside of the outside edge. So those are put in manually at the last. So we have that little point that's added. So it has a little added point that is put in to make that look nice and sharp, but it's a very similar style, right? And this one's ending in the center because it's a single star and it's not made to connect to anything. But we have also, and this is a very wonky oblong star. It was made to actually match a print that was on a shirt that had this kind of stretched flag across it. They wanted to make one of the stars on the flag from the print gold metallic on each one of these shirts. And so we literally had to match the print in the space and make this star. But what do we have here? We have a very similar star to the ones we saw previously. We have the underlay used to make the points. And at this width and at this density with an auto split or a length limited satin, you're going to see I made my own contour underlays in order to make sure I had nice coverage on the dark navy that was going underneath that, and to cover up the star that was already printed. I wanted to have the edges be nice and covered. So I've got edge run as well as that contour, and I wanted to really get that gold to pop off. We didn't want to have it super dense in the actual piece, but we did want to have nice coverage. So what you're going to notice is I've drawn this outline to first be kind of a pathfinder, show me that I'm actually on track with the star itself because it's going over a print, multimedia style. And you'll see those little points that I drew. Those little underlay points are there to sharpen the points of the star. On really large satin stitch stars, we want those little teeny tiny points, or on very small stars and on large stars where we're coming to a point we don't want to extend the satin too far out to be too small, you can use these to make really sharp points. So even really small stars can use those little tiny stitches as well. And I'll show you that in a moment. But same kind of thing. Thing that's interesting is I did this. This is not an automatic underlay that can be had. This is a satin stitch using a Contour 1 fill. So a column, I drew a column before I drew my final stitch and used a contour fill that fills vertically along the drawing of the column, like along the length of the column that you draw, to create that underlay manually. So we have this fully underlaid piece, and then we run that split or auto length limit satin along it. So another way of handling stars, you can handle stars different ways. One of the lessons from the flag we can learn is just because we have one continuous area of color, it doesn't mean it has to be rendered in the same way. Another star can be rendered in this way, the most easy, simple way to handle it. We have just a regular old fill done with mitered corners. And this is from the same customer wanted to cover up a much more normal looking star with a gold star. There was something about that for his branding that he was doing on multimedia. And so we did it on a pre-printed piece. One thing that's interesting to learn about this one, if we look in the angle of the fill, it's going to push out this direction. It's going to push down this direction. If we look at that as far as the way the fill is angled, you see that I've cropped those points so that they don't push out beyond the fill boundary, beyond the satin boundary into those satin stitch points where we have that deep miter. That deep miter has a lot of stitch penetration points in it as well. It's nice to cut off that excess fill before we get there. So another way to handle a big star is to handle it by doing fill with a nice little satin border. None of these are wrong. None of these are wrong. These are all ways to handle the fill. Also, I wanted to get to our lineman here. So these are our little lineman design. Now, this was a hand-drawn design. The lineman himself looks a little mushy. I'll give you that. I think you can see him a little bit better right here if I kind of hold it down without the 3D on it. Lineman was done as a pen style art that was from one of the actual linemen, did it himself, I believe. Not a bad piece, but kind of sketchy piece. Maybe not the best art that was ever done in the world. There's some weird perspectives going on with the boot and what have you, but you do what the customer gives you. What I would say is interesting about this one is we have these stars here. And we see these stars are drawn like a standard pen or pencil star would be when you're a kid. I'm going to go ahead and zip through all the rest of this stuff. The rest of it is very similar to what we've seen before. What is probably interesting on these is the double star. And though this one is not as precise as some of the ones I've done before, what you'll notice is we draw a small star inside and then a larger star on top. And that connects to the next one. And when we do that, we actually fill the inside of the star. And then we get just outside of that, and we get the outer points that are longer and sharper. What that does is give us additional fill on the inside of the star while still having nice sharp points. Instead of it looking like a child's crayon drawing of a star, we get a fairly filled center point that actually tightens up on a lot of these stars. At the actual size of the piece, which we can see here in relation to the other pieces we have, those little drawn stars fill in nicely. Also, I will say this. Another nice thing to learn from this design, if we go back to our lineman, what makes this lineman look a little bit more lively than the original sketch? We have some carving being done here. We have nice satins for the legs. We have the belt called out in its own satin stitch, the hat, the tools, everything are called out in satins. So that by the time we start outlining our friend here, he actually has a filled shirt, smooth satin arms, satin face, and these angles all are opposed. So we have a nice, very carved sort of look to him. But we'll see that the rest of the flag itself is very similar. Even though it's waving and curvy, there's certain things we've done to leave open spaces for our lineman friend here. We've had to do some interesting things to make that work. But what you will notice are a couple things. We've traveled along the fold line. Instead of drawing this fold line where it buckles and folds, I've used travel stitches along that and tried to hide some of them where they're not as attractive. And we do just have really standard overlap satin stitches with a nice deep overlap between the white and the red. So what do we have in this case? I would wager we're probably about 1.2 millimeters. It's like I made it. I didn't have to guess real hard what that was going to be. That was a pretty standard overlap size. So is it the best design on earth? It is not, but there are some interesting things to look from that piece to see that. These little bitty stars done as two star shapes. And let me see if I can do one live without messing it up. Like I said, the time between drawing and getting anything back from the screen can be a little hard, admittedly, to go on with these pieces. But I'll try and first I'll just draw a star and you can kind of see what I'm talking about. I'm sure this will be a pretty wonky little star. If this was our final star, if we just drew one like this, I mean, it wouldn't be the end of the world to draw it like that, but we're probably going to have some issues with it filling in. So what you're going to see me do pretty often with these, especially if I can start from the center, is I'll start from a center point and we draw the internal star first. Like this, and then we extend past it into the external star. And the sizing and the spacing are not quite perfect here. But that is one way we can make a small star that maybe is in two passes, but not directly overlapping when we have enough room. And then we may adjust some of the things to get it exactly even. And what you end up doing is filling in that central area. And especially if you start from the center or a little off center, we have a little tiny stitch that when you zoom out, you'll start to see as I zoom to size where we get a nice little filled star. Now, this is probably a little small, but we can use that kind of tactic to fill in that internal area and draw a nice little sharp star. So it's a nice way to handle that. Plus, depending on how we're doing it, if we're drawing across them, we can start to connect those together like we did on our alignment design over here, so we don't have to jump around so much. This one with the weird kind of waving stars and patterns and stuff is not perfect, but they turned out pretty nicely, and they do knot up into these lovely little stars. As they tighten down on each other, the stitches tighten up under tension, they do make a lovely little star. And in fact, we'll go ahead and show you that again over here on that Cuba design I showed you earlier. Let's jump over to it. The Cuba badge here has very similar stars, little more precisely done, but these are single pass. But what you're going to notice is I've just dropped a single stitch in the center because these are very small stars, right? When we're dealing with these, we can see that if this is a centimeter, we've got a very, very small star here. Top to bottom, this little guy is maybe 2 mils tops and needs to be very nice and clean and sharp. What we can see is in order to make that thing look more full, we've run through the center. So let's go ahead and run up to the point of that star and take a look at that. So we'll have to zoom through all the rest of this mess and I'll have to find where our stars are. There they are. Let's go back to the beginning of our little stars and we can see them. Let's remove them and then let's see if we can't drop those little stars in. Hopefully I can get up to them pretty quickly. I might have gone too far out. All right, let's see if we'll get them back. There we are. Like I said, the refresh between, there we go. Between the screen and the stream can be a little bit agitating sometimes as we're working. If I can't get it, I'll let it go from there, but hopefully we can kind of just show you a little bit of that. I'll back them up a little slower so it doesn't refresh badly. There, you can see them being deconstructed where I do the initial stitch that drops in the center to cover. So there we go. Now we've got it again. So here's where we started. We have a nice tie-in on this piece. So here's our tie-in. We go across. We drop one stitch in the middle. We draw our little star, and we're connected to the next run. Drop our stitch in the middle. Into the next little star run. And what that does is fill in just a little bit of color coverage in the middle of that kind of a pentagon that forms in the middle of a 5-pointed star. But as we can see, are we going to use satins on these little like sub 2 millimeter stars? No, we are not. Are we going to try and use a fill that comes to a point on any one of these? No, we are not. Because of the size of all these little projections off the star, none of these things are going to work. But luckily, we can intimate what's there. We draw them in as close as we can, and we let the thickness of the thread do some of the work. And that's happening all over here. It's the same thing you're doing with straight stitch lettering. It's the same thing you're doing with little tiny details. And as we can see, here's our potato horrible eagles. But when we are at size, our little horrible eagles look fine because we don't need that extra detail. And like I said, the flag is a really good way to show that stuff. Whatever we're doing, we have to realize that reduction in detail and sizing is very similar. So like I said, these are larger and spread apart. We can use satins for them. These ones are larger, but not quite as large as the ones that are in the Lady Liberty, and they're connected in this small area. Obviously, we're not going to do the same thing. If we go even smaller to the smallest size, you can run that same style and still have it look like individual stars at all. Then you can see that that's almost the only way we could do them is with some sort of straight stitch look. And when we get down all the way to the kind of stuff where we're adding the flag not as its own thing, but as part of another design, the way we have in that Cuba badge, well, then we're dealing with something like that overlaid grid where we're just trying to hint that, hey, there might be stars here. You know, there might be that field. And when we're dealing with a population that knows what that design looks like and what it's supposed to be, it's all right. To the point where the other thing people do, now this one I didn't. This one I've got all 4 rays on our Zia. Our Zia has 4 rays. This is the symbol inside of the New Mexico flag. It's called a Zia, from the Zia, the Native Americans of the Zia Pueblo. That's where that comes from. This has 4 rays in each direction, northwest, east, and south. Well, in this case, I've got all 4 rays. I'm going to say it's probably a little too cluttered. I could have, and people sometimes do, either put only 2 rays or 3 rays on each side so that we don't get full coverage. In the case of this one, I did 4. I probably should have done 2. 2 or 3 to open that up a little bit. Though what I'm going to say is, even though this kind of looks like a little diamond from some space away, I'm dealing with a clientele that knows what the New Mexico flag looks like. As I get a little larger, 4 rays are definitely fine. Those will stitch out and look okay. As I get to the full size of a, left chest or a sleeve patch, obviously I'm going with satin stitches. One interesting thing about the Zia with satin stitches, this is another exercise in pathing that all New Mexicans end up doing. If you do embroidery, you start to learn that you run pathing by running these back toward that central circle and capping it off with our central circle. It's another exercise in not picking up the needle. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a design done by someone who's not familiar with pathing, where they're connecting in the middle here, or you'll auto branch something like this, and the software will see how close together these rays look. But those rays, when they actually stitch, certainly spread apart, because we know those satin stitches are going to get narrower, and because the software will dream that these are close enough together when you auto branch them, it'll connect them along this area or somewhere else. Whereas what you really need to do is to manually hop a couple stitches over, as you can see here, in order to connect them into the next run. You jump a couple stitches across that are hidden by your eventual circle that you place at the last moment. Also, you can see room for push compensation. They're all the same length inside of there. Why? Because we don't want them to push through into the circle in the center of the Zia. So, like I said, I know we're just talking through a bunch of designs here, and we're looking at all these different flags. I mean, we've got all these different flags in different places I could also go through. We've got checkered flags as well. But I think what we really have kind of noted on, and here, by the way, is a stock design piece, and you'll see it also has very similar stars. I'm going to zoom in on these with the central point and the 5 satins done very loosely. And that's a lovely little stock design piece somebody wanted us to use. But very similar stars, very similar setup, though the stripes, they did decide to do fills. But what you're going to see is large offsets in those fill stitches. I still think that fills were a weird choice for this particular one, but they wanted a flatter aspect of that so that the eagle sitting on top would sit a little more proud of the design than these backgrounds. But we're looking at all of these, whether we're looking at this flag and eagle design, whether we're looking at the little tiny horrible waving cap flag that looks so bad here but looks so good when you run it at size, whether we're looking at, hey, even the Colorado flag here, the same things are coming up, and they're very essential to embroidery. What are we dealing with? In general, we're dealing with the same kinds of compensation, right? We've got push, we've got pull. They are always in effect, and we have to deal with these. So when satin stitches meet in the same angle, they're going to fall in together, and they're going to pull on the same angle. So we have to increase the pull compensation on the top set. And especially when you're seeing flags that are smaller and smaller, you're going to notice where it looks like the stripes are offset. But obviously, though it looks like somebody will say, man, those look too thick. What we have to remember is if we really are seeing this, and I will mock this as if it's actually happening. I'll use an editing tool so I can mock it as it's actually happening. We have to imagine as this runs and they thin out just a little bit, what's going to happen to those stripes as the pull compensation comes through, as the distortion comes through. This is what's going to happen. And I'll do this by literally removing the compensation live. This is what's going to happen. Now, I can't show pull comp in the same way, but you can see that's going to happen. This will get a little thinner. And the final run will look like this. It'll look much more like this. Even stripes, smaller canton on the one side, and this border will pull away and be a little tighter off to the sides. That's how it's going to run when it finally runs. But for it to do that on screen, it has to look like this. It's the same thing as our little Lady Liberty stars. It's the same thing as any of these pieces. Pull compensation is always in effect. Push compensation is always in effect. And the distortion thereby, those are always going to be in effect. Why do you not see extreme differences in the red and white here? They're fill stitches. And if we look at the angles, where are they going to pull and push? Well, they're going to pull in this angle here. They're going to pull along in this angle or along this angle in the red, and they're going to push opposite to them. Not in any real great way at this size. But when we're on the really tiny flags, the same amount of pull that's going to happen on those individual stitches in relation to the size of the design itself is going to look outsized and crazy because it's about the same pull under tension. It varies a bit, but when we're on smaller designs, the same amount of compensation is still necessary. And when we're looking at that compensation on the same width of satin stitch, it looks crazier when it's much smaller because the items are physically just closer together and there's just not as much area between them in the first place. And it means that you get stuff like this. And admittedly, this one looks pretty janky. I'm going to tell you, I made this in my original software that couldn't draw curves. And you can definitely see that because there's these straight angles that are along all of the curved areas. But once again, you imagine this and it looks like red spaghetti noodles, looks awful. Well, if we take that piece that's here and we just act like it's stitching down a little thinner, and we can see it starts to open up. And this tilted waving flag starts to look a little more reasonable, and especially at size in the thread. But we have to know this stuff. And this is basic to all embroidery. The stuff that we know, the stuff that is going to affect any design we work on does not change. And when we're looking at the same type of design done over these different sizes in these different ways, it can really give us a sense of how that changes, no matter, even if the art is exactly the same, that interpretation is part of it, and that the physicality of embroidery really plays into it. So let's go back to our rules one more time before I finish out with comments and questions. We're dealing with the stars and stripes. Yes, it is all the same design in essence, but we can notice these things. As size decreases, so much detail, to the point that we can have fewer stars, fewer stripes at the very smallest sizes, and that we don't render them as faithfully to the original shape of the 5-pointed stars the smaller we get. All stitches push. All stitches pull. All fill areas are going to push. When you fill an area too much, especially if you really get it densely full, it's going to push a lot. As we are doing any stitches under tension, one stitch under tension gets a little bit shorter. Many stitches on the same satin column, all pulling on the fabric at the same angle, under tension, maybe even a bit more. It's always going to happen. Stitches in the same angle distort more, number one. So if they're all pulling apart at the same angle, also because they're both pulling at the same time, if they're not very deeply inset, they'll keep pulling. They're both pulling away from each other. They're going to make gaps. And stitches meeting in the same angle, fills or satins, they're going to fall together. They're not, stitches don't land on top of another stitch and stay there. The needle will deflect, something will go off. Even if the needle split the other stitch, it's going to try and roll. It's going to try and move. That thread's not going to stay there. It's going to fall together and they're going to blend a bit. So we have to oppose those angles. We have to increase compensation when things meet. And ultimately, when we're dealing with small detail, we have to intimate, not replicate. You don't draw a forest by drawing necessarily trees, and you definitely don't draw a tree by drawing leaves and the veins on each leaf unless you really are doing that very purposefully for a reason. Most of the time, we're just trying to get across the essence of what's there, especially with smaller embroidery, which is often where I see people struggle with flags. All right, folks. So let me go ahead and grab a couple of comments, and then I think we're going to call it for the day. So maybe not an hour and a half, but maybe an hour and 15 as we get done with this. First, Brent said, thank you earlier for me showing some examples on those checkered flags and stuff. Absolutely. You can do that. Now, here's the thing too. Interpretation is obviously subjective. When I show you the classic satin stitch flag, if someone asks you for the classic flag patch, number one, buy them because they're available for very cheaply if you buy them in bulk. Number two, if you're trying to replicate the classic kind of flag patch that you'll see on any military, police, whatever, then satin stitches all the way for those bars. But at the same time, it doesn't mean you have to. If you were dealing with a direct customer and they're cool with you using the white in the garment as the stripes, hey, I did it in the Lady Liberty piece. It's all available. And in fact, by the way, for those of you who want that piece, I will go ahead and throw that into the comments at the end here. I'll give you the link to that. It's over at the Embrilliance blog also. So if you just go to embrilliance.com, you're looking around, there's a project blog in the left-hand side. You'll see a ton of designs from me there that you can download. You get the regular free Embrilliance software, and you can convert them into any stitch file you like. If you're already an Embrilliance user and have that stuff for stitch artists, you can do even more than that because they actually have all the objects exposed. So if you're a stitch artist user, you can get in there and play with the objects. But you can use whatever you need to make these things happen. And as you can see, when you get to small sizes, when you get to difficult designs, when you get to areas where a satin stitch doesn't work, use something else. It's all about what makes the most sense for the interpretation you're trying to go for. And for me, I do really think of embroidery as a textural art, as a three-dimensional art. So you'll see that I care more about what congruous textures are there and how elevated the surfaces are too. The one thing about using the white and then having just stitching in the red is that the white's kind of further back and the red's further forward a little bit. And it's standing up top and it's thick and curved and has a shine and shadow on it, and the white's flat. It's just the background. And so sometimes that can be a little jarring if you don't like that texture. For a lot of customers, a lot of corporate customers, they may or may not care. Certainly. like I said, some of these are there. Oh, and Lisa is actually helping me out. So if you're in the comments right now, you can already get it. So embrilliance.com/archive/3959. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa, for grabbing that for me. But yeah, that's one of those things. Really, that is, you can interpret any way you want to. And Lisa says, those stars in the Lady Liberty, they are such a great teacher. Everyone should stitch this to study alongside the software version. Yeah, please grab it and stitch it. I love that little piece. That was one that I did. And like I said, it's from a stash of materials and printed things and memorabilia from the bicentennial that my mom had. So it was something that I really enjoyed that project. It was a really cool thing to play with. Jerry says, mark this one as a rewatch. Yeah, please, by all means, check it out. Especially if you're doing a lot of, hey, you're doing a lot of stars and bars. It's a really good rewatch. Jerry says, my biggest problem is designing stitch length with doing intricate designs. Yeah, I'm going to say, just talking about straight stitch detail work, I don't like to get too small. We get to a point, especially with light color stitches, where they look very pebbly. I like most of my outline work to stay at 2 mils. Of course, I'm going to go smaller in curves as I have to, but you're also going to see me manually lay out curves with kind of, you'll see these angled stitches going around a curve, and then I'll offset one angle to the next from one run to the next to make them look more round. I do take a little more control back by drawing each line instead of using things like double or triple runs. I often run across a piece multiple times myself, so I can choose where those needles will land. But yeah, what I'll say is almost never under a millimeter, 0.8 maybe, because I don't like to have anything that's supposed to stand up be much smaller than that, because we're getting down to, 0.4 is the little chisel tip length that is mostly the smallest one you'll see for like a fill stitch. That's really meant to kind of disappear. When you're at a 0.5 millimeter, you're trying to disappear, not see something. So I like to be up above that. 1.2 for anything really visible, 0.8 at the extreme, and most of my stuff is set to 2.2 mils for running borders and stuff in detail like that. Most of it's pretty long, and honestly my fill stitches are long too. A lot of people will set their fill stitches at 3.5 millimeters. Mine are generally 4 or maybe even a little above. I like to use nice long lofty fills, less stitch count, and I think a little better color coverage because it raises everything up. All right, so lots of folks. Peggy says, thanks so much. I appreciate you, Peggy. Thank you for saying so, and you're very welcome. Cindy says, gives a cool look. Yeah, and like I said, there's some more in this vein that we'll talk about later. I think I'm going to show some other pieces on another episode, certainly. I think that there's more talking about maybe badges, police badges, fire badges, and military stuff that I might go over at some point, because there's some interesting stuff there. And Candy, you are welcome to it. Candy says, I've stolen and used your stars from Lady Liberty many times. No need to reinvent the wheel. Hey, if they work for you and you like them, steal them. Like I said, there's tons of stuff on the Embrilliance blog from me. And if you're getting them there, everywhere else I've done stock designs, I only put out the DST files. You're only going to get DST and or whatever other machine type files there are that are stitches. But the stuff that I put out for Embrilliance, if you are an Embrilliance user, especially you're a stitch artist person, those objects are in there. And it means you can steal those and play with those and resequence them and anything else you want. They are the .be stitch artist native file. And if you have the native file, hey, pull the parts apart, use it for another part of design. I'm releasing that to the world for you to use. Please don't resell it as is, but if you make something else with it, go ahead. Up to and including reselling stuff that does use the stars out of it. I don't care. And honestly, that's something we want to do for you. So please, by all means. All right, folks. So with that, let's go ahead and call it. It's 1:18, and I think I'm about ready for a break. At the same time, it's been really great running through these designs with you and getting to make up for our 4th of July episode. Thank you for being here. And by all means, yeah, hey, steal from yourself. Also, by the way, keep your own slush pile of stuff that you have that you can reuse. Keep those designs and pull stuff off them. If you think that I redigitize every star every time I do a yes flag, you're also wrong. A lot of those flags are real similar for a reason, folks. Copy and paste. It is where it's at. Like Lisa says, we're all about reuse. And thank you guys for watching. Thank you for being interested. And thank you very much for being here. Get out there, stitch something yourself. If you're in the US or otherwise, make your flag and show me, because I would love to see more flag designs. I actually have lots of flags I didn't get to today that I would have loved to try and play with. Lots of cool stuff. In fact, I also very much like civic heraldry, so city flags and city seals around the world, stuff like that. Maybe that's another episode we'll do later, some heraldic elements, coats of arms, stuff like that too. Show me your flags and get out there and stitch something. Honestly, the best way to learn any of this, the stuff we talked about today, is the essence of embroidery. It's the thread interacting with the fabric and the stabilizer under tension. Go out and stitch, watch stuff stitch, stitch, correct, and restitch. All right, folks, with that, I'm going to let you go for now, but I cannot wait to see you again for next week.